part of your critique of Barack Obama, right? So we are having this conversation apart. You reached out to me after having listened to um, one of my favorite, but a challenging conversation that might have been the first time I interviewed Norman Finkelstein on this program. If I recall correctly, it was like a 3-hour conversation that we edited down a bit. We don't edit down stuff like that anymore. I think it was early on in the podcast, and I didn't realize the really high tolerance this audience has for very long, kind of Socratic conversations. But in that debate, we were going back and forth around what then was his new book that had these I think, substantive criticisms of Obama, but I was caught on what I felt to be some less substantive and maybe distracting criticisms of Obama. And we were going back and forth, and he reached out about that and surfaced some of your own critiques of Obama from back in 2016. And I thought it might be interesting to have someone like yourself back on to, again, weigh in on what we might have learned as a Black community from our expectations of Barack Obama, and then looking forward to Kamala Harris and what you make very specifically of the economic policies that she's articulated, to the extent that she said much at all. Obviously, there's no policy on her website as of now. And kind of what the lessons learned are in terms of our expectations of kind of Black representational politics.
Yeah, my expectations are fairly low. And I think that as a community, Black Americans should have had relatively low expectations in 2008. I think people have not paid any attention to the issue of the historical record that's associated with the post-colonial countries on the African continent, in which people who look like the mass of the population have leadership roles, but actually don't do anything but essentially line their own pockets. And so I didn't have any significant expectations from Barack Obama, in part because I was aware that the mere fact that somebody looks like you doesn't necessarily mean they would commit themselves to working on your behalf. But moreover, Barack Obama was pretty explicit in saying that he wasn't going to do that. And I think that there's this widely circulated video of Kamala Harris saying something to the effect of, well, I'm not going to be seen doing something just for Black people. And so there's absolutely no reason to anticipate that just because somebody is Black, they will be activists on behalf of the Black community, even if they are in major positions of authority. So the question for me is not, how somebody looks. The question for me is, what's the substance of the program that they want to pursue?
I remember that interview. It was conducted, I think, by a classmate of mine from college, Natasha Alford. And there's been an effort to sort of recontextualize that interview now that Kamala Harris is the chosen one, which is pretty mind-blowing.
So by default, it affects Black families, but there's not a particular policy for African Americans that you would explore.
But no, if you look at the reality of who will benefit from certain policies, when you take into account that they're not starting at the same place and they're not starting on equal footing, it will directly benefit Black children, Black families, Black homeowners, because the disparities are so significant. So if we focus on the specific issues that have resulted in the greatest disparities, and we understand that that's part of why we're doing it. Listen, the reality also is this: any policy that will benefit Black people will benefit all of society. Let's be clear about that. Let's really be clear about that. So I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit Black people. No, because whatever benefits that Black family will benefit that community and society as a whole and the country.
But I guess maybe the question that I should ask then, I'd really love to get into your assessment as an economist of, one, what you think Kamala is prescribing to the extent that she's offered much of anything at all. And since that's probably kind of a shrug because we don't know much about what she plans to do, what you would like to see from her, both because it is a kind of a morally justified and legally justified prior, and because potentially it might help her, frankly, electorally electorally improve her standing with Black voters, a group I should point out she's struggled with since the 2020 primary.
Yeah. So I think there is one program that I'm aware of that she has floated, which is a $25,000 mortgage supplement for first-time homebuyers. And she has suggested that this would somehow have some significant impact on the racial wealth gap. There's a number of problems there. The first is the overstatement of the significance of home ownership as a component of individuals' portfolios. If you start talking about folks who are at the upper end of the wealth distribution, and I'm not talking about a handful of people, the upper quarter of the wealth distribution, home equity is not as significant for them as other kinds of assets like financial assets, home non-residential properties, business ownership, their retirement accounts, and the like. All of those things are at least as significant, if not more so, than home ownership in terms of their portfolios. And so I think there's a romanticization of home ownership in this country. Stems from the building of the middle class discriminatorily, the middle point of the 20th century through the GI Bill. But if we're talking about closing the wealth gap, we're not talking about a focus exclusively on the middle class among whites. We have to take into account the wealthiest whites as well for really addressing the magnitude of the gap. And so that's the first problem, that home ownership is not the whole story. Second problem is a $25,000 mortgage supplement's not going to take you very far if you're in a country in which the median home price is somewhere in the vicinity of $500,000 to $550,000. Third thing is, if it's only for first-time home buyers, then what are we doing about the impact of the wealth gap on individuals who are already homeowners or who at some point in the past were homeowners? It's a significant share of the population. It's got to be in the vicinity of 50% of Black Americans who have owned a home at some point. But that leaves another 50% who would be eligible for the program, but it's not going to do a great deal. And then, of course, it doesn't do much of anything for folks who want to be renters for whatever reason. Yeah.
And the reason is millennial commitment issues. As I raise my hand here, isn't one of the other problems that it was first advertised as a kind of cash payment or an upfront payment, and then it turned out to be a tax credit, so that you would have to have the money for the home upfront anyway, which also seems to be a significant barrier.
It's another barrier. Yeah.
Maybe as I'm listening to you talk, it occurs to me that I'm coming to this sort of as someone who was very much involved in participating in the discourse around these issues back in 2016. But some listeners, because they're younger or just were not engaged back then, might not be as familiar with concepts like the racial wealth gap or understand why these sorts of things are important. So perhaps you could give people a sense of what the gap is, maybe how it has grown or shrunk since we were last discussing these issues seriously as a country back in 2016 or 2020.
So this is the easiest question you've given me all day. This is squarely in my wheelhouse. So, I have been for quite a while now heavily engaged in thinking about this thing that we call the racial wealth gap. And I think it's important to distinguish wealth from income, first of all, because I think frequently people confuse the two. So by income, we're referring to a flow of resources that people get within a given amount of time, usually a year, that stems primarily from their earnings, from their receipt of transfer payments from the government, and from any interest that they accrue off of the various assets that they might hold. And that's very different from the concept of wealth, which is a stock measure of the net value of your personal property, the difference between what you own and what you owe, or the difference between the value of your assets and the value of your debts. And as I mentioned earlier, the array of assets could include non-residential properties, it could include homes, it could include retirement accounts, it could include a business that an individual owns, or it could include financial assets like stocks and bonds and the like. The debts, the categories of debts that are probably most familiar to us might be your mortgage payment, or it could include your credit card debts, or it could include student loan debts, which have been politically very significant in recent conversations. And so, why do I think wealth is important to look at? Well, primarily because I think wealth is a much better gauge of your opportunity and economic security than your annual income. And that's in part because of the fact that if you have an income loss, say due to joblessness or due to a medical emergency, if you have a solid wealth position, then you've got the capacity to weather that storm. And similarly, wealthier people have the capacity to buy their way into high amenity neighborhoods, ensure that their kids get quality schooling. They have the capacity to cope with a criminal justice system emergency in terms of getting quality legal counsel in a way in which individuals who don't have that same type of wealth position are not able to do so.
Or even bail, right?
That's right.
Even
they can meet a bail payment.
Reform. Yeah,
exactly. And then of course they can also leave resources to their children and grandchildren to give them a leg up in terms of having a solid position financially in their lifetimes. So wealth is a very powerful instrument. And so when we start talking about the wealth gap, we're talking about the difference in the amount of wealth that Black and white Americans possess. And that difference is staggering. If you go back to, well, I think President Biden has made this statement a number of times that the wealth gap is at its lowest level in 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've heard him say that.
I have heard him say that. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it.
So it's correct if you measure wealth in a particular way, or if you measure the gap in a particular way. So people frequently want to think about the ratio of Black to white wealth as an indicator of the magnitude of the disparity. And I would argue that that's a useful indicator, but if you're looking at changes in the gap over time, it can be very misleading. So if we were to take the year 2019, the ratio of white to Black wealth was about 6.9 or so. And then we look at the year 2016, and the ratio of white to Black wealth has declined slightly to about 6.5. So, there's people could say, well, yeah, the wealth gap is improved because there's a narrower difference between white and Black wealth. It's not a whole lot narrower, but it is narrower. Well, but the difficulty is that while you get this decline in the white to Black ratio in wealth, you get a widening gap in the monetary value of the difference between white and Black wealth. So
what does that mean? That the extremes are more extreme, even though the highest earners? Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I'm talking about the average, the mean difference.
Okay.
And you also will have the same kind of effect if you just look at the median, which is the more conservative measure that just focuses on households in the middle each group's distribution. But
So help me understand, because math was not my subject and I never took
Okay.
economics. My apologies. So you're saying that help me translate what you're saying about the ratios, demonstrating a closing of the wealth gap, but numerically,
yeah,
yeah.
so so the measure in 2019 would have meant that the average white household would have had $69 to every $10 that a black household had in wealth.
Mm-hmm.
But in 2022, they would have had $65 for every $10 in wealth held by a black household.
Okay.
Okay, that's the ratio. Okay.
Okay. But you're saying that Black families actually don't have that $10. It's actually, they have less money overall than they did back in
No,
2020.
what I'm trying to say is that the difference in the average value of wealth between black and white households actually got larger between 2019 and 2022 when we look at the actual dollar values.
So what does that mean?
When we're looking at the ratio, we're taking the average amount of wealth that a white household has and dividing it by the average amount of wealth that a black household has. That's a different type of calculation from taking from subtracting the amount of wealth that a average black household has from the amount of wealth that the average white household has. So when I start talking about looking at the actual monetary value, I'm telling you do a subtraction exercise rather than do a division exercise. And here's why it matters.
Okay.
You do the subtraction exercise, the difference between black and white wealth in 2019 was about $841,000.
Mm-hmm.
Even though the ratio then was higher than it is in 2022. But in 2022, the difference between black and white households in terms of net worth on average was $1.15 million.
So to what do you attribute that? Policy wise or
Well,
economic,
I think
COVID, whatever wise?
the driving factor with the wealth gap is the transmission of resources across generations. Black folks don't have any to transfer, and white folks have a lot to transfer. That's the fundamental difference. And so, if you're looking at the situation over time, there will be a tendency for this difference in wealth to actually get larger and larger,
To compound.
even
Yeah.
if the ratio doesn't get larger.
Okay.
Yeah. So you're moving from $841,000 to $1.15 million. And even if I were to make an adjustment for inflation, that's a significant increase in the gap, somewhere along the order of 16%.
Yeah, I mean, that is pretty incredible. And I would say from a political perspective, I'm not putting any words in your mouth, that it is incredible to me that you have a president, a white president, who is frankly trafficking in a certain kind of misinformation in an effort to distinguish himself policy wise or kind of value wise from the Republican nominee without actually addressing what you've described as a worsening scenario economically for Black Americans, not to mention and things aren't going great broadly.
Well, let me be a little bit precise about that. A worsening relative scenario.
Sure. I mean, sure. But this is the question, right? Like, who is best for Black America? I mean, that is what these, the gentlemen that we saw in that supercut are kind of weighing in on. And I got to say that, I mean, like, that is not, those gentlemen aren't particularly sympathetic in their rationale.
It's not at all clear that one party or the other is better for Black America. What is clear to me is there is one party that is determined to establish a condition in which they have permanent rule in the United States. That's what frightens me.
I think it's a perfectly fair place to kind of center your own politics. But I have to confess to you that there's many people listening to this podcast who feel very differently, that feel like the reason why you have someone like Donald Trump who's in a position to wield that sort of power is precisely because the Democratic Party, which is supposed to be the counterbalance, has been derelict in its responsibilities to deliver for the coalitions that have been historically within its wheelhouse. So for the sake of this conversation, I'm very interested in what you just said, which is that even from your perspective, I mean, that's a pretty heavy thing to say, but from your perspective as, in my mind, the foremost expert in the racial wealth gap, disparity research, disparity economics, and all of that, that it's not clear to you that either of our major political parties is above the other with respect to what it's able to deliver economically or what they've been able to deliver economically for Black Americans.
What they've been willing to deliver.
Economically.
Yeah.
So from that lens, looking at all of those men.
There have been other candidates who are not in the position of running for president who had programs that I would say had the potential for being much more beneficial to Black America.
So I want to come back to that and ask you specifically who you're talking about and what policies you mean. But just to underscore this point, as much as it's easy to sort of roll your eyes at the inaccuracies stated by the men in Don Lemon's supercut, the fundamental belief that it's a toss-up between Democrats and Republicans with respect to the economic fate of Black Americans. On that point, they're not necessarily wrong, you're saying.
Yeah, I think, I'll have to confess, I can't say that they're necessarily wrong on that point. And I as I said, that's the reason why the door has been open.
Yeah.
To misinformation, if you will, from the Trump camp.
Yeah. And, to the point we've been making here also from Joe Biden, to the extent to which he's kind of selling himself in the Democratic Party as having conferred all this benefit to Black Americans, or to at least have reigned while these benefits accrued, when those benefits are kind of numerical chicanery, right? So I want to come back to what, kind of your prescriptive, the prescriptive place you're about to go to, where you said there are other people who have run for office at different times, have run for president at different times, that did offer policies that would have meaningfully taken a bite out of the racial wealth gap. What are those policies and who are those people?
Well, I think you know that my answer is going to be that if we're going to actually have a comprehensive assault on the racial wealth gap, it's going to require a program that is on the order of a comprehensive national reparations plan. That there's no indirect policy that I'm aware of, like giving people housing subsidies, that's going to close the racial wealth gap. It's very difficult to conceive of or construct what we might refer to as a universal policy, where we give something to everybody that would actually close the racial wealth gap. There are some possibilities there, but nothing that I've seen anybody propose fits that mold. So my sense is that if you want to really close the racial wealth gap, you do it by making direct payments to Black Americans who are eligible. And from my perspective, the eligible population should be Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved in the United States. So that's how you do it, just straightforward.
Hey, YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.